Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In 1993, three 8-year-old boys went bike riding in West Memphis, Arkansas. By the next day, their bodies were found in a drainage canal, sparking a wave of satanic panic that would lead to one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history. Three teenagers, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley Jr., would spend 18 years behind bars for these murders, with one facing death row. But did their alternative lifestyle and interest in heavy metal music make them killers, or were they victims of a rush to judgment? Tonight, we dive into the disturbing case of the West Memphis Three. On May 5, 1993, in the small city of West Memphis, Arkansas, three 8-year-old boys, Stephen Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, disappeared while riding their bikes in their neighborhood. What followed would become one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history, a story of rushed justice, satanic panic, and the power of public perception. The boys were last seen around 6:30 p.m. that evening, riding their bikes together near their homes in the Robin Hood Hills area of West Memphis. When they failed to return home for dinner, their families became worried and began searching the neighborhood. The police were called and a search party was organized, but darkness had already fallen over the small Arkansas town. The following day, May 6th, a juvenile parole officer named Steve Jones was helping with the search when he spotted something unusual in a drainage canal that ran through a wooded area known locally as Robin Hood Hills. What he discovered would horrify the entire community. The bodies of all three boys were found submerged in the muddy water, stripped naked, and bound with their own shoelaces. The autopsies revealed devastating details. Christopher Byers had suffered the most severe injuries, with mutilation to his genital area. All three boys had multiple injuries consistent with beating and drowning. The medical examiner would later testify that the boys had been forced into submission through brutal attacks, then drowned in the shallow creek. The brutal nature of the crimes sent shockwaves through the community. West Memphis, a city of roughly 28,000 people, had never seen anything like this before. The police were under immense pressure to solve the case quickly, and the community was gripped with fear and anger. In the early 1990s, America was in the midst of what has become known as the Satanic Panic, a period of moral hysteria where many communities became convinced that satanic cults were operating in their midst, threatening their children. This cultural context would prove crucial to how the investigation unfolded. The West Memphis Police Department, lacking experience with crimes of this magnitude, quickly focused their investigation on the angle of satanic ritual abuse. They were particularly interested in anyone in the community who didn't fit the conventional mold, anyone who dressed differently, listened to heavy metal music, or showed interest in occult subjects. This led them to 18-year-old Damien Echols, a local teenager who had a history of mental health issues and was known for wearing black clothing, listening to Metallica, and having an interest in Wiccan beliefs. Echols had previously been in trouble with the law for relatively minor offenses and had been hospitalized for depression and suicidal thoughts. To the police and many in the community, he seemed to fit their preconceived notion of what a satanic killer would look like. Through their investigation of Echols, the police also became interested in his close friend, 16-year-old Jason Baldwin. The two were frequent companions, and Baldwin shared Echols' interest in heavy metal music and alternative culture. The police theory began to take shape. These teenagers must have killed the boys as part of a satanic ritual. The break in the case, as far as the police were concerned, came when they interviewed Jessie Misskelley Jr., a 17-year-old acquaintance of Echols and Baldwin. Misskelley had an IQ of 72, placing him in the borderline intellectual functioning range. On June 3, 1993, after nearly 12 hours of police interrogation, only less than an hour of which was recorded, Misskelley confessed to helping Echols and Baldwin kill the 3 boys. The details of Misskelley's confession were problematic from the start. He initially stated that the murders took place in the morning, though it was well established that the boys had been in school that day and were last seen in the early evening. He gave several different accounts of how the murders occurred, changing details each time he was corrected by investigators. Despite these inconsistencies, the police considered the case solved. On June 3, 1993, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley Jr. were arrested for the murders of Stephen Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. The arrests seemed to provide relief to a community desperate for answers, but they would mark the beginning of a legal saga that would span nearly 2 decades. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Misskelley's confession, despite its numerous inconsistencies. They also presented evidence of the defendant's interest in occult practices, including Echols' journal writings and testimony from various witnesses who claimed to have heard the teenagers discussing the murders or admitting to them. The trial of Jessie Misskelley Jr. was held separately from Echols and Baldwin's, primarily because of his confession implicating the others. Despite recanting his confession and claiming it was coerced, Misskelley was convicted on February 4, 1994. He was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 2 20-year sentences. The joint trial of Echols and Baldwin began on February 28, 1994. The prosecution painted a picture of a satanic ritual murder, using the defendant's interest in heavy metal music, black clothing, and occult subjects as evidence of their guilt. They brought in Dale Griffiths, a self-proclaimed expert in occult crime, who testified that the murders bore the hallmarks of a satanic ritual. The defense tried to point out the lack of physical evidence linking their clients to the crimes. There were no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon was ever found, and none of the victims' blood was found on any of the defendants' clothing. The crime scene itself showed no signs of satanic ritual activity. However, in the climate of fear and suspicion that pervaded West Memphis, these arguments seemed to fall on deaf ears. On March 19, 1994, both Echols and Baldwin were found guilty. Baldwin was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Echols, considered the ringleader, was sentenced to death by lethal injection. At just 18 years old, he became the youngest person on Arkansas's death row. The convictions of the West Memphis Three might have marked the end of the story in many people's minds, but it was only the beginning of a long journey toward justice. As the cases gained national attention, serious questions began to emerge about the investigation and trials that had put 3 teenagers behind bars. HBO documentarians Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky arrived in West Memphis shortly after the murders to document the case. Their resulting film, Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, released in 1996, brought widespread attention to the questionable nature of the convictions. The film highlighted the lack of physical evidence, the problematic nature of Misskelley's confession, and the way the community's fear of satanic influence had seemingly overwhelmed rational consideration of the evidence. One of the most troubling aspects of the case was the handling of Misskelley's confession. Expert analysis revealed that the interrogation techniques used were highly problematic, particularly given Misskelley's intellectual limitations. The police had used leading questions and fed him details about the crime, a technique known to produce false confessions, especially in vulnerable subjects. When the unrecorded portions of the interrogation were later scrutinized, it became clear that Misskelley had been subjected to psychological pressure and manipulation. The physical evidence, or rather the lack thereof, became increasingly significant as forensic science advanced. despite the violent nature of the crimes, which would have likely resulted in significant blood evidence, no blood was found on any of the defendants' clothing or in their homes. The prosecution had claimed the lack of evidence was due to the murders taking place in water, but experts later pointed out that this explanation was inconsistent with the crime scene evidence. The prosecution's expert witness, Dale Griffiths, came under particular scrutiny. It was revealed that his doctorate came from a non-accredited correspondence school, and his expertise in occult crime was based largely on unscientific assumptions and stereotypes common during the Satanic Panic era. His testimony about supposed occult signatures in the crimes, such as the presence of 3 victims and the full moon, was later thoroughly debunked by actual experts in forensic science and religious studies. As the years passed, support for the West Memphis Three grew. Celebrities including Johnny Depp, Eddie Vedder, and Natalie Maines became vocal advocates for their release. More importantly, legal experts and forensic scientists began offering their services to review the case. What they found was deeply troubling. In 2007, new forensic evidence emerged that would dramatically change the trajectory of the case. DNA testing, which hadn't been available during the original trials, was conducted on evidence from the crime scene. The results were striking. None of the DNA found at the scene matched Echols, Baldwin, or Misskelley. Instead, hair consistent with Terry Hobbs, Stephen Branch's stepfather, was found in the ligatures used to bind one of the victims. Further investigation into Hobbs revealed that he had a history of violent behavior and that his alibi for the time of the murders had significant inconsistencies. However, it's important to note that Hobbs has consistently maintained his innocence and no charges have ever been filed against him. The new DNA evidence was complemented by other scientific findings that contradicted the original case. Forensic experts determined that many of the wounds on the victims' bodies, originally attributed to ritual mutilation, were more likely the result of animal predation after death. The supposed knife marks were actually consistent with turtle bites, common in the creek where the bodies were found. In 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court ordered a new hearing to consider the new evidence. The hearing was scheduled for December 2011. But before it could take place, prosecutors approached the defense with an unusual proposal. They offered the West Memphis Three a chance at immediate freedom through an obscure legal maneuver known as an Alford plea. An Alford plea allows defendants to maintain their innocence while acknowledging that prosecutors have enough evidence to secure a conviction. It's a controversial legal mechanism that often leaves neither side fully satisfied, but in this case, it offered a practical solution to a complex situation. The state could avoid admitting a wrongful conviction while the defendants could secure their freedom. On August 19, 2011, after more than 18 years in prison, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley Jr. walked free. The price of their freedom was entering Alford pleas to 3 counts of first-degree murder. They were sentenced to time served plus 10 years suspended sentences. Echols, who had spent years in solitary confinement on death row, later described the decision to take the plea as devastating, but necessary for survival. The release of the West Memphis Three was met with mixed reactions. Many supporters celebrated their freedom, but lamented that they had to plead guilty to crimes they maintained they didn't commit. The victims' families had varying responses. Some continued to believe in the original convictions, while others, including John Mark Byers, the adoptive father of Christopher Byers, became convinced of their innocence and advocated for their release. The aftermath of the West Memphis Three case has continued to reverberate through the American justice system. The case stands as a stark example of how wrongful convictions can occur when fear, prejudice, and rushed justice combine with inadequate legal representation and questionable forensic evidence. Since their release, the three men have worked to rebuild their lives while continuing to advocate for justice reform. Damien Echols moved to New York with his wife Lori Davis, who had begun corresponding with him while he was on death row and later became instrumental in the fight for his freedom. He has written several books about his experiences, including Life After Death and High Magic, and has become a prominent voice against the death penalty. Jason Baldwin relocated to Seattle, where he earned his law degree and now works to help others who have been wrongfully convicted. His transition to freedom was perhaps the most challenging of the three, as he initially didn't want to accept the Alford plea, feeling it would compromise his principles. He only agreed to it because he knew it was the only way to save Echols from death row. Jessie Misskelley Jr. returned to West Memphis, maintaining a lower profile than his co-defendants. His case continues to be studied by legal experts as a prime example of false confession and the dangers of aggressive interrogation techniques, particularly when used on juveniles or individuals with intellectual disabilities. The case has had lasting implications for the American legal system. It has been frequently cited in arguments against the death penalty and has led to increased scrutiny of confession techniques used by police, particularly in cases involving juveniles and vulnerable individuals. The role of media coverage, both in potentially prejudicing cases and in helping to expose wrongful convictions, has also been extensively studied through the lens of this case. The question of who really killed Stephen Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers remains officially unsolved. While various theories have been proposed and investigated, no one else has ever been charged with the murders. Terry Hobbs, despite the DNA evidence linking him to the crime scene, has maintained his innocence and was never officially considered a suspect by law enforcement. The case has also highlighted the lasting impact of the satanic panic on the American justice system. The rush to attribute the murders to satanic ritual, despite no evidence supporting such a theory, reflected a broader societal tendency to seek simple, albeit sensational, explanations for complex and disturbing crimes. The West Memphis Police Department has faced ongoing criticism for their handling of the initial investigation. Critics point to numerous failures: the contamination of the crime scene, the failure to follow up on other potential suspects, the coercive interrogation of Misskelley, and the department's apparent fixation on the satanic ritual theory despite lack of supporting evidence. The role of forensic science in the case has also prompted important discussions in the legal community. The original trials relied heavily on now discredited forensic theories, including the interpretation of wound patterns and the analysis of fiber evidence. The case demonstrates how forensic science can evolve over time, potentially invalidating evidence that once seemed conclusive. The victims' families continue to grapple with the unresolved nature of the case. While some, like John Mark Byers, have become vocal supporters of the West Memphis Three's innocence, others maintain their belief in the original convictions. Pamela Hobbs, Stephen Branch's mother, has expressed uncertainty about what really happened to her son, highlighting the complex emotional toll that wrongful convictions take on victims' families. The case has inspired numerous books, documentaries, and academic studies. Beyond the Paradise Lost trilogy, other works like Devil's Knot by Mara Leverett have helped to keep the case in the public consciousness and continue to introduce new generations to its important lessons about justice, prejudice, and the power of public perception. Perhaps most significantly, the case serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing fear and prejudice to drive criminal investigations and prosecutions. The targeting of Echols, Baldwin, and Misskelley, largely because they were different. Their interest in heavy metal music, their black clothing, their non-mainstream beliefs, reflects a broader tendency in society to scapegoat those who don't conform to conventional norms. Today, the The West Memphis Three case is frequently taught in law schools and criminal justice programs as an example of how wrongful convictions can occur and the importance of protecting defendants' rights. It stands as a reminder that justice requires more than just the appearance of solving a crime. It requires careful investigation, respect for evidence, and protection of defendants' rights, even when public pressure demands quick answers. The case also demonstrates the power of persistent advocacy and the importance of allowing new evidence to be considered in criminal cases. Without the years of work by supporters, attorneys, and investigators, the West Memphis Three might still be in prison today, with Echols facing execution. As we reflect on this case nearly 30 years after the murders, it serves as both a warning about the dangers of rush to judgment and a testament to the possibility of achieving justice, even if delayed and imperfect. The three young boys who lost their lives in 1993 deserve to have their true killer brought to justice, and the three teenagers who lost 18 years of their lives to wrongful imprisonment remind us of the heavy cost when the justice system fails to live up to its ideals.